Hello and welcome to this webcast with Cindy Wigglesworth, who will be sharing with us how spiritual intelligence helps you develop empathy, compassion and wisdom, and speaking about the four intelligences: intellectual, emotional, physical and spiritual, and how they're linked to leadership. Before I introduce Cindy, may I just say a few words of welcome and introduce myself. I'm Jay Blythe, the Community Development Leader for the Barrett Values Centre. I'm going to be your host for the next hour or so, and this is the third in a series of webinars featuring key speakers who will be joining the 2016 CTT International Conference, which opens in Toronto on September the 28th, 2016, this September. And may I just say it's my great pleasure to welcome you all from all continents to this webinar. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. And may I invite you to take a moment just to let go of any distractions that you might have in your immediate surroundings, and to bring your attention to your intention for being here for this webinar. And also to mention that you're part of a group. We have 130 people registered here in this session. So to support the high call quality that we're hoping everyone enjoys for this call, we are going to keep everyone on mute. However, we do want to receive your questions, so please put your questions into the question dialog box, which you will see on the right-hand side of your screens. Hopefully you will have a control panel with a box that says questions. And if you put your questions in there, I'll be looking for those questions as we go through the session. Okay, so please put your questions in the chat box. If you're here by a computer, you'll be able to see the slides as we go through this. For all of you, please know that these slides will be sent around after the session, along with links to Cindy's webpage, Cindy's posts, and also links to the conference if you'd like to come and join us to hear more about what Cindy has to share with you. So it is now my great pleasure to welcome and introduce Cindy Wigglesworth. Cindy is a public speaker, a leadership consultant, executive coach, and expert in spiritual intelligence, particularly how to measure it and keep it practical, especially in the corporate settings. And Cindy links her work with emotional intelligence, cognitive complexity, rational intelligence, and physical intelligence, and works with the four intelligences of masterful leadership. She's also the founder of Deep Change, a multinational network of experienced leadership development consultants, executive coaches, leadership development trainers, team facilitators, and multiple intelligence experts. Cindy, you've also published a book called SQ21, in which you share some of the things you're sharing with us today. And in this book, the endorsement from John Mackey is something that's particularly significant and worth a mention. He writes, "The 21 Skills of Spiritual Intelligence is a guide to your own hero's journey. If you want to emulate people like Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, Socrates, and Mother Teresa, now you can see what it takes." That is why we are here. We are here because we are in a complex and challenging world, and 130 people have come to listen to guidance from you, Cindy, and support on their journeys to their own hero's journey. So I now be delighted to hand the room to you, Cindy, and welcome you to our session.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So today we're going to do just a quick tour of the way I approach the four intelligences of leadership, which when I group them together I call deep intelligence, and I often refer to them as critical intelligence for leaders, but honestly they're critical intelligences for humanity. I think as we face our next evolutionary tipping point, these four intelligences will be crucial if we're going to navigate our way through them. So let me go ahead and jump in. If we could get to the next slide. You'll see that the four intelligences are often shown when people talk about multiple intelligences, and this has been really well popularized by Ken Wilber's work. We can think about that we might be at different levels of development across our multiple intelligences. Now, depending on who you listen to, there might be 4 or 6 or 8 intelligences, but I stick with these primary 4. And the goal of this vertical bar chart is to just help you think about the fact that you might be highly developed on your cognitive intelligences, or your IQ as we often call it, but not as well developed on EQ or emotional intelligence, maybe even less developed on your spiritual intelligence, and yet you might be highly developed on your physical intelligence. So the point of this chart is to say there's some degree of independence across the line. So partially true and useful chart. Now let's look at the next chart. The next chart I call my pyramid chart, and this is a different way of looking at multiple intelligences, which shows their dependence upon each other and the sequence in which we tend to develop them as human beings. Now here you see PQ, or physical intelligence, is at the bottom of the chart. When I talk about PQ, I'm talking about being aware of your body and being able to skillfully use it. As a child, as a newborn, there's so many things we have to learn. We have to focus our eyes and learn to roll over and to crawl and to walk and to run and to tie our shoes. So many things before we can even enter schooling have to be mastered in terms of our body. Now, that's not to say that IQ does not develop during those preschool years. Of course, it is also developing. But PQ is really foundational to everything, including as adults. If we don't take care of our bodies, if you don't get enough sleep, if you don't eat right, if you don't take care of your health, it can crash your ability to think clearly. It can crash your ability to have good relationships. So relationship skills, intellectual skills are built upon our ability to take care of our body. So PQ is at the bottom for two reasons. One, it is very much the first thing that kids have to focus on after they're born. And IQ comes developmentally, not that it's not happening from the beginning, but as a focus area, it's really happening in the school years. So we go to school, we develop our IQ and learn math and history and science and so on, and develop our verbal skills. At the same time, we are beginning our emotional intelligence development, emotional intelligence being our relationship skills, but EQ is dependent upon some parts of the brain that are not fully developed until about age 22 to 25. So while we can be developing some good relationship skills along the way, our ability to fully inhabit these skills is not available to us until the brain is completely developed. And even then, there's no guarantee that we will choose to develop them. There is some free will here. EQ is an interesting intelligence in that, IQ seems to have some limiters genetically, like there's only so far any one of us can go. I'm not going to be Stephen Hawking. But EQ seems to be learnable by pretty much everybody if we choose to put the effort in. So EQ is an intelligence, a set of skills that we can learn and we can continue to improve on throughout our life. It shows a strong age correlation, meaning that skills develop across time, but there's no guarantee that just because you get older, you'll become better at interpersonal skills. And we probably have all met some people who, no matter what their age, have not bothered to develop their interpersonal skills. Then the top of this pyramid is SQ, and this is my field of focus. I teach EQ and SQ together because they're highly interdependent intelligences, but SQ takes it to the next level, and I think that will become clear as I go through this presentation. So what the bar chart showed us is that intelligences have some degree of independence of each other. You can be high IQ and low EQ, for example. But this pyramid chart, also just a partial truth, but a useful partial truth, shows some degree of building upon each other, that PQ is foundational to all the rest of the intelligences, that PQ tends to be the focus of our early childhood, followed by IQ being the focus, followed by EQ being the focus, especially as we move out of our schooling years and into having romantic partnerships, raising children, and having a job. The research around EQ is undeniable, that every job ever researched shows a positive correlation between performance in the job and the degree of emotional intelligence you have. So the demands in the workplace for EQ are pretty high. What has not been well articulated previously, and what I've dedicated my post-ExxonMobil career to the last 15, 16 years, is to articulating what is spiritual intelligence. So let's go ahead to the next slide. This, for the folks on the call who are familiar with Richard Barrett's work and the Corp Tools model of 7 levels of corporate consciousness, 7 levels of individual consciousness, is this is a helpful linkage. If you're not familiar with this model, you might want to go to the corporate tools material that's available on valuecenter.com. I'm sure Jay will be sending out a link later. I got attracted to this model because it had immediate resonance for me. I was working with a major healthcare organization. They wanted a tool to assess how they were doing at living their corporate values, and so I went on a search. I found the Richard Barrett tool, fell in love with it, got certified, they used it, and I will tell you, more details will be shared in Toronto, but that organization made it to the Fortune 100 best employers in large part because of the application of EQ and SQ and the measurement of how they were progressing using the Corp Tools model. Now, this model is built on Abraham Maslow and is an extrapolation of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And you can see the clear link on the left, very similar to my model. You have physical at the bottom, but then you have emotional. So we have a little bit of difference in terms of how we're building up from the bottom. But in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, survival was number 1. And then relationships and emotional needs, and then the desire to achieve, and IQ and mental skills coming on board at that point. And then the top 3 levels of corporate and individual consciousness are related to what you might call spiritual needs, the need for meaning, the need to make a difference, and the need to be of service in the world. So I can't take any more time on that except to say that for those of you who are Corp Tools trained, very strong connection between my work and Richard's, and I'm a big fan of this tool.
I'm just going to jump in there, Cindy, and thank you for connecting it to the case study and that it showed the progress on the SQ and the EQ. But I just want to flag that Corp Tools was the old brand, and it's now known as Cultural Transformation Tools, which is the CTT. So
I got trained 15 years ago, so I'm showing my age. So Cultural Transformation Tools.
My apologies for not clarifying that before. Thank you.
No problem. I'm sorry, I'm a little out of date. All right, so let's go on to the next slide. We need to chat a little bit about our terms. What do we mean by the word intelligence? And intelligence, as I use that term, is an innate potential brought into form through practice. What that means, if you look at the little girl practicing the piano, is that she may be born with the natural ability, sort of the innate ability to be musically gifted. But if she never has a chance to play the piano, never learns music theory, never practices, she will not bring her personal musical intelligence into form. So IQ you may be gifted with, but you need to develop your math and verbal skills. EQ you may be gifted with, or you may have to struggle a bit to learn it, but you have to bring it into form through practice. That is sort of the generally accepted approach in the multiple intelligences world. So let's go on to the next image. In terms of the research, the world of multiple intelligences exploded when IQ was first developed and then discovered to be an inadequate description of what makes people successful in the world. So initially the thought was that IQ, as we think of it today, was all you needed to know to decide whether or not someone was going to be successful at work. But in fact it turned out to be just a very weak predictor. It had some predictive value, but it wasn't super strong. So the curiosity was then piqued about how do you look at successful leaders and start determining what is beyond, what is more than IQ that is making them successful, maybe find a stronger predictor. That is how the field of emotional intelligence got built, is that just by following successful leaders around and researching what was different, they discovered that interpersonal skills were a crucial part of leadership success. The way we describe this now is IQ matters. IQ, and some people misunderstand the research and say it's not IQ that makes you successful. IQ does matter. IQ gets you in the door. But once you're in the door to your field, whether you're a lawyer or a nurse or whatever you're doing, a teacher, it doesn't matter. Whatever your field is, there's a minimum threshold to get in where you have sufficient IQ to do the work. But EQ differentiates and makes people successful.
Hey, could I jump in here, Cindy, with a question we've received?
Yes.
This is a question from, and apologies if I pronounce your name incorrectly, Federico Greb. Hi Cindy, he said, where would you place moral intelligence, the ability to make decisions based on what we believe is right? Does it overlap with SQ?
It totally overlaps with SQ, and that's a great question, and I will answer it before we conclude today, or you can follow up with me via email, but right on, perfect intuition that person's having about the relationships here.
Great.
All right, so let's move ahead. Here you see the diagram that I was first introduced to when I began studying EQ, which is Daniel Goleman and Richard Boyatzis' model. They call it EI, but most other people call it EQ for emotional intelligence, where the skills fall into 4 quadrants. Based on their research, you have to start in the upper left with self-awareness in order to, and then follow the yellow arrows, to go to the right, develop social awareness, and go down to develop self-management skills. And then you can get to the relationship skills in the lower right-hand corner. Those relationship skills are the things that impact our ability to be official or unofficial leaders in the world, to be good change agents. If we could advance to the next slide, you'll see a list of the skills of emotional intelligence that Goleman and Boyatzis have used. Now, this list has changed over time, but what has not changed are the ones in yellow, which are highlighted because they have been occasionally referred to as meta skills, skills that are super important, completely not negotiable, and if you want to have any of the social or relationship skills in the lower right-hand quadrant, like developing people, being an inspirational leader, being influential, being a good change catalyst, handling conflict well, being a good team member, if you want any of those, you must have emotional self-awareness, empathy, and emotional self-control. Emotional self-awareness means I understand my emotions and I understand what's triggering them. So I not only understand and I'm aware in the moment that I'm getting angry, but I see that I am getting angry in response to how I'm interpreting the world around me. This is the beginning of SQ is here. So if you don't have this skill, there's no SQ either. You have to see that you're creating your emotional state before you can gain any power over it. And that's where emotional self-control comes from. Also, what we've learned is that to the degree you understand where your emotions come from, you will have empathy or the capacity to build empathy with other people's emotional states. If I'm unconsciously reacting to the world and not able to name my own emotions, I will be lousy at predicting your emotions or even caring about your emotions. If I don't care about your emotions and demonstrate that to you, there's no trust and there's no ability to do the social skills in the lower right-hand quadrant. All right, let's jump ahead quickly to spiritual intelligence. I'm going to give you a high-level intro and then we'll pause again. So to the next slide, you see an image of how I usually begin this conversation. So if we could advance to the next one, we will see an image here of Martin Luther King Jr. and Gandhi. What I typically do in a workshop is I have an exercise where before I tell people what I think spiritual intelligence is, I have them tell me what they think it is. So that rather than engaging in an argument where I'm the expert and I'm telling you what it is, you tell me, what do you admire? Who are the noblest people you've ever heard about, read about, been exposed to, and tell me what you know about them that causes you to admire them. Now on slide 11, you will see a typical list, next slide, of the people in workshops that will come up. So we will get major religious figures being listed like Jesus, Buddha, Muhammad, and so on, the Dalai Lama, and political leaders, change agents who are admired like Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, and so on. And then an assortment of other people such as relatives, teachers, and authors. And if I work in healthcare, oftentimes nurses will list their patients as being major spiritual teachers for them. And I've had in the course of doing this, 4 bosses have come up as spiritual leaders, which just goes to show it is theoretically possible for a boss to be a spiritual leader. All right, let's go to the next slide. The more important question than whom do you admire is why. Why do you admire these people? What are the character traits that cause you to admire them? This is a partial list, but you get the idea. People will say, I really admire this person because they're loving, kind, compassionate, humble, wise, courageous in the face of really scary stuff, faithful even when it's challenging to be faithful, and so on, forgiving, honest, integrity, peaceful, nonviolent, inspirational, persistent, able to see the gifts inside of others and to help develop those gifts. So we make this list, and it may be much longer than this, but you have the general theme, and then I ask, would you like personally to have more of these character traits? Pretty much everybody says yes, because that's why they admire them. Now, I'm not saying you need to be a saint, but would it be nice to be a little bit more like this? And I also ask, would you like to see more of these character traits in your organization? Never had a company say no. So generally speaking, this is an admirable thing. So this is the baseline of what is spiritual intelligence, is to be more like this. So let's take a pause. Any thoughts or questions coming in yet, Jay, that we need to address?
We had not any further questions at the moment, no.
Okay, well, let's roll on. Let's go to the next slide.
Yeah.
So when I said about trying to define terms, and I spent 20 years at ExxonMobil, so I'm very much trained by engineers to be precise in your terminology. So I said about doing this to satisfy that level of inquiry. Like if I could explain this inside of an oil industry company, then maybe I got something here. So how could I explain what I mean by spiritual intelligence? What's my definition? My initial thought was to be more like these people would mean to behave with love. But love in the English language is a sloppy word. In English, we use the word love for people. I love my daughter, I love my son, I love my spouse, and we use it for food. I love pizza, I love ice cream. This is very sloppy, so it wasn't very helpful. And I didn't want to use complex terminology. I didn't want to use Greek or Latin terms because for many people that feels elitist and off-putting. So I went on a search for a simple, elegant definition of love, and I found a parable from the Eastern traditions that just kind of gave me goosebumps when I found it. And that is the parable that love is a bird with two wings. One wing is wisdom, the other wing is compassion. If either wing is broken, the bird cannot fly. And I just loved that. It just touched me so deeply. It had that truth ring in my body. And I thought wisdom is the best of the mind. Compassion is the best of the heart. It's the both. And we bring it together in action. Action from our bodies, actions from our words. And that is spiritual intelligence. Love is wisdom and compassion. So if we turn to the next slide, you'll see now where the definition comes from. The definition of spiritual intelligence that I use is that spiritual intelligence is the ability to behave with wisdom and compassion while maintaining inner and outer peace regardless of the situation. So the ability to behave with love. Behave is a crucial word because we can say we feel love when we're off meditating in the wilderness. But when we get back into the traffic or at the grocery store or in the office, it's much harder to behave with love when you're dealing with so many irritating other human beings. So can we behave with love? Can we behave with wisdom and compassion while maintaining a sense of equanimity, our inner peace, our calm? To be calm on the outside is easier than to be calm on the inside. And being calm on the outside is often the first step. To restrain ourselves from yelling and hitting people is a good thing. So if that's all you got, do that. Do outer calm. But sustainable is inner calm, where you have gotten to the point of so understanding your own emotions that you can interrogate your own assumptions about why you're getting angry. At the EQ level, you can name, I get angry when people interrupt me. Well, at the SQ level, you've interrogated that threat and that fear reaction and said, there's really no threat when I'm being interrupted. I can stay calm and just respond to the fact that probably that's not an okay behavior, or maybe it is in this case. Maybe what I need to say is completely unimportant and what this person needs to say is more important. But the inner sort of sense of distance allows you to be far more wise so that calm self, the observer self, can come on board. The regardless of the situation is the saintly level of application, because we all have times when we can be calm and peaceful and loving and then something happens and we lose it. I think the people we most admire are able to do this more of the time rather than less of the time. I think of it as sort of a percentage thing. I don't have to do it 100% of the day because that's unrealistic, but in any day where I can do this more than half the time, that's a great day. So I look at it as a constant challenge for me to work on myself to show up with more and more spiritual intelligence. Let's go to the next slide, and we'll do a couple more and then we'll pause again. So the next slide are some crucial definitions that I often get asked to explain. What's the difference between spirituality and religion, and what's the difference between those two things and SQ? Spirituality is the larger word. Spirituality is an innate human need to be connected to something larger than ourselves. Abraham Maslow addressed human needs in his hierarchy of needs, and in his final book, he realized there was a level of development and a level of human needs that went beyond self-actualization into self-transcendence. And those are the top three levels that are in the Richard Barrett model, and that is the area that I'm trying to work on through SQ as well. So the belief is, it is in our nature to have this hunger to be connected to something larger. That need can be suppressed and distorted, but it is basically there. Now, what's the difference between spirituality and religion? A religion is a structure created by human beings to support us in meeting our spiritual needs. So we build buildings like churches, synagogues, and temples. We have practices, doctrines, monasteries, different ways of organizing our sanghas or communities in order to support ourselves in being better human beings, to develop ourselves and to become more spiritually authentic. So the religion is the smaller word, spirituality is big, and then religion becomes a support structure ideally designed to support our spiritual needs. Of course, we've seen situations where religion can be twisted and used in ways that feel very damaging to society. I often make the comparison to fire. Fire is a wonderful tool. It cooks our food and keeps us warm. It can also be used to do great harm. So religion is kind of like that. It's the tool that we can use to develop ourselves. I consider my approach to be faith-friendly, faith-neutral, but also atheist-friendly. So it is not required that you have religion in order to have SQ, but it's also not to say religion is bad. Religion can be a very supportive process for people on their spiritual intelligence effort. Now, SQ, the third definition, is a set of skills. It's really important to differentiate between beliefs and skills. What my goal is to help people behave with love, to behave with wisdom and compassion while maintaining inner and outer peace. What I'm looking for are things that we can learn, and truthfully, I wrote this for myself. My goal was, raised as a Roman Catholic and later sort of more spiritual but not religious, I really loved the concept of love your neighbor as yourself. But that is hard because most other people are really annoying, at least some part of their lives. They're driving me crazy. So how do I develop the skills to be more forgiving, more kind, more peaceful? And so I wanted to look at people like Nelson Mandela, people like Thich Nhat Hanh, the Dalai Lama, and say, what's beyond EQ? What are the skills that they have that I would like to have that take me past IQ, past EQ, into this domain of what I would call virtuous human behavior? I think that's a good place to pause. Why don't we see what we've got, if any?
Okay. Thank you, Cindy. So we've had a question from Luc Lemaire, and this was in reference to the slide you had which spoke of the common traits of spiritual leaders. And Luke is asking, how many of these traits do you practice yourself as a teacher in this matter? I've heard you speak a bit about that already.
How many of these character traits or behaviors? I would aspire to all of them. I would say on any given day, my ability to embody them is highly variable. I do not consider myself saintly or perfect in any way. I am on this journey along with everyone else. I wanted to describe the journey so that I could focus my effort. We only have so many years on this planet and I wanted to use my time to develop myself as best I could. I don't think you can be a good coach if you haven't done your own work, and so I try to be as reflective and honest as I can about I'm not claiming to be all this stuff.
Yeah, I love that you said this spiritual intelligence definition. Actually, you built that for yourself. So you've been making a pathway for you in this work as well. And that honesty shows through and that integrity shows through in what you're sharing here with us. And I've heard there's a few comments. There's love your definition of SQ. That really speaks to me. Thanks, Cindy. That's from Phil Clothier. Hello, Phil. Jim Ware, comment, very fine ideas, really liking this. Federico Greb, I promise this is my last question. That's fine, Federico, keep them coming. Do not want to take over, so I'm guessing you're making space there for your fellow callers. But do keep your questions coming. Could Cindy elaborate on spirituality and the quest for meaning? Specifically, is it possible to practice or develop SQ and be an atheist?
Yes, absolutely. You can be highly spiritually intelligent without having specific beliefs about a deity. So the question often is, it's sensitive because for some people, they can't imagine that you wouldn't have a belief in God and develop it, and you could still develop SQ. But let's move on and I'll show you what I mean. So let's go to the next slide. Oh, sorry, you have one more.
We have a couple of other questions come in. Do you want to take them now or do you want to move on?
Take them now and then I'll flow them into the presentation.
All right. Anna Coutinho is asking, can you give us an example of someone who uses EQ but doesn't use SQ? And then Rory Cohen, it's a question about the conference. Yes, Cindy will be talking at the conference about either today or at the conference about opening doors for talking about this with clients, especially corporate clients.
I'll absolutely talk about that in Toronto. You have to customize every presentation for the needs of the client. This is client-driven communication, not me telling you what you need to hear. It's really what is the best thing to serve the client. I try to approach each engagement with this question: what is the loving thing to do? Because that's my definition of SQ. So what's the loving thing to do for this client? If the client doesn't really have any interest or draw for SQ at this point, but their problems are very EQ related, then I teach EQ because EQ is far more acceptable normatively and foundational to SQ. So I really feel I'm still on mission as long as I'm helping people, and you can look at it through the Richard Barrett lens of moving up the 7 levels. What's the next level that is called for to be of loving service to this organization?
And may I add one more question just received before we carry on, which links to what you've just mentioned. From Martin, it's called Claw, I can't pronounce that, I'm so sorry. I am interested in knowing how Cindy describes the transition work needed. The 7 levels model, 4 to 7, from transformation to transcendence.
Very big question, may not get to that in the next 15, 20 minutes. We'll talk more. Or, maybe, Jay, down the road there'll be a need for a future webinar. We can think about that. But let me get through what I can get through today. So here you see an image designed to kind of make you chuckle, but it's also the essence of SQ work, which is becoming aware that we have an ego and that it's often immature and somewhat narcissistic, like this guy who's combing his one hair on his head. He's very self-preoccupied, or very blaming, as you see this young woman on the right-hand side pointing a finger outward. It's not my problem, it's your problem. So there's sort of this narcissistic inward focus, all about me, and there's this blaming outward projection. If we look at the next image, what SQ helps us do is to shift from this focus on our ego self to our higher nature. And I just love these photos. I was looking for photos that embodied sort of wisdom and humility and a sense of humor. And that woman on the left, she doesn't have any teeth left, but she's smiling. And I just love that. And there's something beautiful about these two faces that kind of captures for me the being at peace with yourself, and finding a loving space to interact with the world, not being all about my ego, but being about service. And that's the whole goal. Now, if we go to the next slide, you'll see that this model is called SQ21 because there are 21 skills of spiritual intelligence. And they're broken into 4 quadrants. These 4 quadrants closely mirror the Daniel Goleman model. That's intentional. My thought was that EQ would be here and SQ would be right above it. And there would be a set of self-awareness skills that would be more difficult. There would be a set of social awareness skills that would be more difficult, a set of self-management skills that would be more difficult, and a set of social skills that would be more difficult. Those are the 4 quadrants that I have renamed a little bit from what his names are to be capital self, capital S self, higher self, ego self-awareness. Quadrant 2, instead of social awareness, is universal awareness. Quadrant 3, instead of self-management, is higher self, ego self-mastery. And quadrant 4, instead of social skills, is social mastery and spiritual presence. These 21 skills are designed to describe what makes our spiritual exemplars different from everyday good interpersonal skills kind of folks. So the difference between a person with good interpersonal skills and a person of high spiritual intelligence is what I am attempting to describe. So the question that was asked about that is embedded in these 21 skills. I'm going to show you in more detail a few of these skills, particularly skill 3, awareness of your values hierarchy, and skill 14, living your purpose and values, because those are highly related to those folks who are working with the cultural transformation tools.
Thank you. Lovely.
So let's go forward, because obviously this is a huge model. And let me just say that every one of these 21 skills has been broken down and described, and I just love this picture of this young man, from the white belt to the black belt, from the novice to the expert. So if you have a genuine intelligence, you should be able to describe it this way. And so one of my criteria of was this useful or not was, could I describe every one of these 21 skills that way? Now, if you look at the next slide, you'll see that awareness of higher self and ego self, which is skill 5, has been described, and this is a bit of a simplification. I have a longer definition of each of these, but at level 1, you just have to know that you have an ego and that it has been shaped by your experience. A lot of people are at 0 on this skill. They have not thought yet about the fact that they have an ego and how it was constructed. So even level 1 is a step forward. So each of these has an assumed level of 0 as the beginning point. At level 2, I have been learning to watch my own ego in operation. At level 3, I have been watching it long enough that I'm seeing the patterns emerge. I can recognize situations that trigger my ego, and I notice what I tend to do in those situations. So I notice that every time someone in authority interrupts me, I get livid and I tend to withdraw, or I tend to whatever. So I'm noticing the pattern. So this is becoming increasingly real to me. At level 4, I can consistently hear the voice of my higher self, which is for many people effortful initially, to learn to quiet the ego enough to hear the voice of the higher self, which is often a more subtle, quiet inner voice. At level 5, which is sort of the highest level, saintly level, if you want to think of it that way, the Dalai Lama level, the ego is no longer in battle with the higher self. The ego has surrendered to a new role of being in joyful service to the direction of our highest self. So that's the goal. Now I may have a minute or 2 of this a year where my ego is completely surrendered. This is not like I get there and I'm done. This is kind of like, okay, I had a moment where my ego didn't try to take over. Isn't that fabulous? So each of the skills is described this way. Let's jump ahead a few slides now to look at skill 3. We'll go past, oh, I'm sorry, this has animation, doesn't it? We'll go past the animations on this, Jessica, when you have a chance, and get that. Thank you. The awareness of values hierarchy, because some of you will be very interested in this. At level 1, I understand why it's important for me to have personal values. I just understand that it matters. It's purely cognitive. I haven't embodied anything yet, but at least I'm thinking about it. So this is level 1. At level 2, I can specifically name my values. So the note there, you see, all you have to do is name them and believe in them. You don't have to be living them yet. You just have to name them and believe them. At level 3, I have found a way to connect my personal values to the voice of my higher self. So these become interdependent skills. I have to hear the voice of my higher self, and then I have to connect it to my personal values. So my values are somehow serving compassion, wisdom, and peace. At level 4, I have rank ordered my values. In other words, I've decided this is number 1, this is number 2, this is number 3. That matters a lot for decision making in a crisis, because oftentimes values will be in conflict with each other. And so if you have made a decision that work trumps family, then you will make a decision that way. But if you say family is more important than work, and you get asked to make a decision in a moment where truly someone in the family will be harmed by that choice, because you've wrestled through that in advance, you'll be able to say, look, I really care about my job and I care about this company, but right now my spouse needs me. He or she is having a chemotherapy treatment next week. I can't make that meeting. I'm sorry, it's not happening. So rank ordering values is a really crucial part of embodying them. And then at level 5, my higher self is so strong and in control that decisions become relatively easy, even when the consequences may make me sad. So that's skill 3. Let's look at the next skill and then we'll pause. Skill 14 comes out of quadrant 3. So here we're getting into self-mastery. So we've gone from self-awareness to self-mastery, being aware of your values to living your values. At level 1, I have the courage to speak about my mission and values, but only with people I trust. At level 2, I speak about my mission and values in appropriate settings, even around people with different points of view. At level 3, I am willing to make values-based choices even if no one will ever see it, so I'm not going to get any praise or approval for it. And I make choices which are aligned with my mission or life purpose. So I'm now really starting to embody what I say my purpose is, what I say my values are. At level 4, and not everybody gets here, and I'm not saying everybody should, but I would make values-based decisions and mission-based choices even if there is significant personal cost, including loss of job or loss of support from family or friends. For many people, they have left, for example, the church of origin in order to pursue what felt like a more authentic spiritual path, even if that meant they got uninvited from holiday dinners. Those are the kinds of personal costs we're talking about. You might have relationship issues, you might even lose your job, but because you believe in something, you might report a company misbehavior to a hotline or whatever. And then at level 5, and these are kind of Nelson Mandela level, Dalai Lama level people, I would make values-based choices even when my own life is at stake. Again, not everybody needs to be here, and sometimes we can't know until confronted with a real-life choice, like people were in World War II. Would I make a values-based choice when my life is on the line? We don't really know. We can say we know, but truly until we're faced with it, we don't know. So this is the degree of granularity that I built into the SQ21 to help me think about how do I become a better human being. I've only got so many years on the planet. I have this great aspiration to embody love. What's that look like? You know, and if I take people I admire and people that many people admire and break it apart, what would it look like? So I think you get the texture of what it looks like. And I think we can pause now and just have a conversation.
Fantastic. I'm getting a real sense of the granularity that you've put into this, Cindy, that it's the intelligence applied to spirituality, the practice, the skills, and the ability to have a definition you can grapple with and work with, and that's making it applicable for others to the pathway, which is of great value to us all. So thank you for your work on this. And looking at
I didn't say, but I built an assessment in order to validate this concept. So there is a tool that assesses, it's a self-assessment, people take it and
yeah, great, fantastic.
Yeah, and the research that we've done multiple levels of research to validate this. If people are interested in it, I can certainly talk more about that tomorrow, and I have materials I can share.
And can people access that assessment through contacting you or through your website? Or yeah.
Yes, through my website they can purchase it, or they can email me directly, and I can connect them with a coach who we've trained over 300 people at this point, and we have people all around the world who can support you in, okay, I've got the assessment and I get a 20-page report, which is great, but I really want to talk about this. So
someone to walk the journey with as a coach too will understand the framework. Fantastic. So you've got that network as well. Wonderful. We've got some questions coming in. There are various descriptions. This is from Inenke van den Berg Mortel, and I'm doing my best. I apologize if I pronounce that incorrectly. There are various descriptions of the term ego. What is your description?
Ego is a very complicated term. You can get as complex as you want to. I tend to really like the work of Carl Jung, but I don't want to distract people with lengthy complexities unless it's necessary. So the simpler definition of ego is it's the smaller side of me. It is the side of me that is prone to fear. It is tied to what you might call the reptilian brain or the limbic system. It's not bad. I think that's an important distinction. Some of the spiritual literature tries to destroy the ego, and I don't think that works. I think it just makes the ego more defensive. I think the ego is a necessary structure to navigate our lives. I've had a Jungian therapist for 20 plus years at this point, and he refers to the ego as a time and space organ. It is necessary to navigate time and space. So if our higher self exists in the outside of time and space realm, the interface between our higher self and our ego self is essential. The ego is part of how we embody and experience life. The fear I feel through my ego allows me to understand your fear. And if I detach from my ego and make it wrong, I become less compassionate and less wise. So it's about maturing the ego.
There's a beautiful paradox there, isn't there, that the ego is a sense of separateness, but actually by accepting it, that's how you can connect with others.
Indeed, and I'm a huge fan of adult development theory, which shows how the ego can mature. It very much mirrors Abraham Maslow's observations that as the ego matures, we naturally become committed to service of others.
Beautiful. Thank you, Cindy. So, looking at our questions again, what ways do you support people in finding and listening to their higher self voice? That's from Phil Clothier.
And hi, Phil. Good to hear from you. I don't like to be overly prescriptive. We do have, like in the training we do for coaches, we give them like this matrix of ideas. If you're trying to develop this skill, here's a list of ideas. But we also encourage the coaches to work with the client around things that are compatible for them. So if someone comes to me who's Roman Catholic and is devoutly Roman Catholic, I would suggest we look within the Roman Catholic tradition for the retreats and the meditations and the contemplative prayer practices that would support them hearing their soul, their spirit, the voice of God, however they language it. We're very generous in our use of synonyms because words can be a barrier. So if I get overly locked up about I have to talk about higher self this way, that's not helpful. So I let people bring their preferred terminology, their preferred belief systems. We don't tamper with people's beliefs. We try to help them develop the skills. Now if someone has no practices and comes to us spiritual but not religious or atheist and says, you know, how do I develop listening to my higher self? We would find practices that are not going to trigger allergies or allergic responses in the client, like mindfulness training, for example. Buddhism is often, especially if sort of married with psychological interventions, cognitive behavioral therapy types of things, you put that together as a package and you find what will work for the client. What's the loving thing to do for the client is the guiding question.
So that links to a question we had from Jim Ware, is mindfulness practice or meditation necessary to connect with spirit?
I don't like necessary. I'm showing my own biases here. I think interiority and reflection is necessary. The practice to get you there can be different for different people. For some people, sitting with a cup of coffee in the backyard watching the birds is how they describe their practice. Now, if I have to put a label on it and say, well, you need to be practicing mindfulness, they're already practicing mindfulness, you know? So how we get there is different. I have never been very good on sitting on a cushion kind of meditations, but I find nature, particularly time staring at the ocean, puts me in a natural meditation. I find painting when I'm painting beautiful scenes of nature to have the same effect. I think we need to be flexible about how we help people. But some kind of calming, self-reflecting, whether it's journaling or whatever it is necessary.
We've got a few questions. Thank you, Cindy, for that response. We've got a few questions about application in education, the question of how do you teach spiritual intelligence in a modern class, and also how and when do you use SQ in a corporate environment. So maybe I could open that to you, but those to you as a sort of general about application.
Application. So I'm not a teacher, but I have interacted with teachers who are very interested in bringing EQ and SQ into the classroom. Again, you have to be responsive to the situation, what is needed. Many schools are experimenting with different forms of meditation, mindfulness, calming practices. Sometimes what you call it is the biggest barrier. So my four-step shorthand for being more spiritually intelligent in the moment is to stop, observe, understand, and love, SOUL. So the stop is stop the brain from the yak, yak, yak that the ego is doing. Take some deep breaths and center yourself. Pray if that makes sense. Do whatever makes sense. Ask for help from another human being, but stop, insert a pause. In the pause is your power. Now that is both EQ and SQ, and you can teach the pause and count to 10 without putting any baggage of a model around it. So as a school teacher, you can teach kids to stop and count to 10, and you are teaching EQ and SQ right there. So simple skills, simply explained. Observe, notice what's going on with you. In classrooms, they use these smiley face charts a lot to help children develop emotional self-awareness. Fantastic foundation for building empathy. Empathy is a precursor to compassion. Compassion is a more advanced form. And some other time, maybe in Toronto, we'll talk about that. But if there's no empathy, there's no compassion. So empathy is a foundational skill. Teachers can teach the smiley face chart and then have people role reverse. Now, what do you think Tommy is feeling? Okay, I get that you're feeling angry. You just pointed to that. Oh, well, Tommy might be sad. Huge gift to the planet if we teach that. So it's an example of breaking it down to skills, breaking it down to appropriateness. You don't have to talk about your model. Just teach the skills.
Beautiful. Thank you. There's quite a lot in the chat box. There's a lot of general, this is so clear, this is so helpful, very fine ideas, really liking this. Thanks for your authentic answers, Cindy. The question about opening doors with clients and corporate practice, maybe I could put that back in the room. How might you take this into that context?
Yes, my particular set of skills, because I worked at ExxonMobil for 20 years in human resources, I've got training and a whole lot of things. So I'm very grounded, and in my approach, I think people feel, if you know the spiral dynamics language, that I have a lot of orange, and so that's level 4 on the corporate cultural transformation.
So quickly translating it, it's high performance, measurement, achievement, that kind of way that shows up in the world.
Yes. So I've got IQ skills and I've got lots of business experience, and so I kind of come in not trying to make business wrong, but to try and help business excel. And if a consultant comes in with a bias that's anti-business, it is quickly identified. So I would say my first strong piece of advocacy for those who want to help business is you must love business before you can help business. Just you might love every client before you can help them. Love your children before you can help them. So love first. Do your interior forgiveness work if you have some to do, and find what is beautiful about business. And then they'll feel it, and then you help them diagnose what's the goal. And then as you build trust, and I say build an emotional bank account, kind of Stephen Covey's concept, if they trust you and you can help them with one thing, like this person you're interacting with is an introvert and you're an extrovert, and here's some basic skills on dealing with introverts. Oh, wow, maybe she knows something. Then we get into the conversation about EQ and SQ as appropriate. But I've gotten away from having to teach people my models before I teach them the skills they need. And I think that was a defense mechanism I had when I was insecure, of needing to say, well, here's this complicated research and this big fancy model. people don't care. They want to know if you can help them solve their problems. So
Yeah.
explaining the model is useful for some clients. For some who especially are INTJs, they have to understand the model first, but not everybody is that interested. So having some flexibility in how you approach your clients is important.
I'm conscious that we have a few minutes, a couple of minutes before we close, and there are a few questions. So I'm just wondering whether to read a few of these and then invite you to make a sort of closing response. So I didn't hear you talk about the soul as Richard Barrett does. Does it fit in your story and work? And another individual has said, how about people who make a values-based choice to destroy their life and the lives of many others in praise to their God? There's something about religion, something about soul there. And then, it is difficult for me as a woman to watch others, especially men in a power position, to make decisions that are hurtful to others or against the institution and policy. When I speak up, I'm made into a monster, insulted by them, lose job or such. This is, and hang on, let me just scroll down and find more of this. They are actually monsters, but I shine the light on their actions. This takes a lot of courage and it brings punishment. How would a person keep their self-confidence while feeling this kind of social outcasting? And then another question. So these some very broad, challenging themes here. And it might be that we pick on these for further sessions. How could we transform a business organization where its top leaders are very much at the fear and level 1 Barrett consciousness model, so that the leaders can live with values and purpose? So those questions are touching into the fear that is a lot of what we're facing and dealing with in the world at the moment. So I invite you to perhaps make a few comments there, Cindy, before we close the session.
Great. So some quick comments which will be incomplete, but hopefully pointing in the direction. The word soul, for me, is a synonym that I would use as one of the many synonyms for higher self. So higher self you could call Atman, soul, spirit, Christ consciousness. There are many, many synonyms. If you go to my website under resources, you will see a glossary. I actually have glossaries in multiple languages now, but the English language glossary, if you click on that, will show you some of the synonyms, including the word soul, used as a synonym for higher self. I think Richard and I have slightly different uses of that word, and being clear about how we use words is a really important part of the conversation and learning to love and understand each other. No right or wrong, just what is the person you're speaking with meaning, and then helping them connect it to the model. In terms of fear, let me just generally talk about fear. Fear can lead us to do a lot of things at the survival level. It can pull us down in the CTT levels to level 1 pretty quickly. It takes quite a saint to stay at levels 5, 6, and 7 in the face of the threat of physical harm, which is why it's level 5 on skill 14. You know, it's the slide that's still on the screen here. I would make values-based choices even when my own life is at stake. There was a surprisingly helpful video that I saw from a former CIA agent, a woman, who was describing how what she learned while working at the CIA is that everybody thinks they're the hero of their own story. Mm-hmm. And it was one of those, you know, I've worked a lot on forgiveness and on perspective shifting, but it is helpful to just get that 2x4 at the side of the head. An Islamic terrorist murdering a priest in France, as happened this week, does not see themselves as evil. So how do we get inside that perspective and serve the evolutionary impulse of humanity? Because we have a choice as a species. You know, most species, like dinosaurs, didn't have a lot of choice. They got hit by an asteroid and that was it, you know. But I think we have the ability to influence whether or not we survive as a species. And our choice to survive requires personal transformation. We have to get to a place where we've removed the systemic and personal barriers to vertical development on the 7 levels of values. There are things that happen in people's lives that make it very hard for them to even get to level 4. And so if we're going to get to that level of personal transformation, what can we do that would serve the planet rather than increasing the hate and increasing the judgment? We have to have discernment and say, this is not okay. We're not going to allow this behavior, but we're not going to slam it with solutions that create more of that behavior down the road. I think the challenge for us is to figure out, with complexity thinking, with polarity mapping, with all kinds of tools at our hand, systemically, what do we need to work on as a species if we're going to be around 200 years from now and have any kind of life that we want to leave for our descendants. So I think I'll just have to leave it at that.
Cindy, thank you so much for those very important thoughts and that call for us all to practice our own hero's journey, our own evolution. And for me, a beautiful takeaway is, what is the loving thing to do here? That question you work with, that's the one takeaway that will sit with me. Thank you so much for this time. We will have to connect and talk about if we can have another session. There's been such a high attendance and still questions are coming in. All participants will receive links to a copy of this broadcast, links to Cindy's website, links to pieces on the Huffington Post that Cindy has written around compassion. They're very worthwhile reading, as well as links to the CTT 2016 conference, of course, where you can join us for more dialogue and deeper insights and taking this work further. So thank you all for being with us today, and thank you, Cindy, for
Thank you
bringing
for having me. It's been a
pleasure.
Blessings.
It's been an honor. Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.